Sometimes a man can survive 20 years in the wilderness, but he can't survive 20 years without human connection. Ezra McKinnon learned this truth the hard way when he finally came down from the mountains with nothing but $1 in his pocket and a heart that had forgotten how to hope. In Cedar Falls, he traded that dollar for a broken-down house, thinking he'd found shelter. Instead, he found 5 abandoned mail-order brides who'd been left behind by men who broke their promises. What happens when a man who's forgotten how to live among people suddenly becomes responsible for 5 women who've lost faith in promises altogether? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and copper as Ezra McKinnon shouldered his worn leather pack for what he knew would be the last time. At 53, his joints reminded him daily that the harsh mountain winters had taken their toll, but it wasn't his creaking knees that finally drove him down from his remote cabin. It was the silence that had become too heavy to bear. 20 years of self-imposed exile had seemed like a reasonable sentence after Sarah's death. The consumption had taken her slowly, and Ezra had blamed himself for not getting her to the doctor in Denver sooner, for choosing a life so far from civilization that help was 3 days hard riding away. The mountains had been his penance, his hermitage, his way of ensuring he'd never fail anyone again. But this morning, as he watched a family of deer graze in the meadow below his cabin, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, loneliness so sharp it cut deeper than any winter wind. The deer moved together, communicated in ways he'd forgotten humans could, and when danger approached, they protected each other instinctively. Ezra envied them their simple certainty about belonging somewhere. Hidden deep in his pack, wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked between his spare shirt and ammunition, lay Sarah's wedding ring, a simple band of gold that had cost him 3 months' wages when he was 25 and foolish enough to believe love could conquer anything. He'd carried it with him every day for 2 decades, a reminder of his failure, but this morning it felt different. This morning it felt like permission to try again. The trail down to Cedar Falls was familiar beneath his boots, though he hadn't walked it in over 2 years. His last trip to town had been for supplies and a brief, uncomfortable conversation with the general store clerk who'd asked too many questions about his solitary life. The clerk's wife had looked at him with the kind of pity that made grown men want to disappear, and Ezra had sworn he'd rather starve than endure that again. But starvation, it turned out, came in many forms. A man could have all the game, meat and wild berries he needed, and still waste away from the hunger that gnawed at his soul. The town of Cedar Falls sprawled along the banks of a modest creek that wound its way down from the higher elevations. What had once been a simple trading post had grown into a proper frontier settlement over the past decade, complete with a main street lined with wooden sidewalks, a church with a modest steeple, and enough saloons to keep the miners and ranchers content after long days of labor. Ezra's boots echoed hollow on the wooden planks as he made his way down Main Street, acutely aware of the curious glances from shopkeepers and passers-by. His buckskin jacket and weathered appearance marked him as clearly as if he wore a sign announcing his hermit status. Children peeked at him from behind their mothers' skirts, and he caught fragments of whispered conversations that made his cheeks burn with embarrassment. The land office occupied a narrow building squeezed between the barber shop and the millinery, its windows so grimy that the interior remained a mystery until Ezra pushed through the door. A brass bell announced his arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed to mock his nervous disposition. Harold Pembroke looked up from behind a desk that groaned under the weight of survey maps, deed books, and correspondence. The man was perhaps 40, with thinning hair and the soft appearance of someone who spent his days indoors shuffling papers rather than working with his hands. His eyes, however, held a shrewdness that made Ezra instantly wary. "Well, well," Harold said, rising from his chair with practiced enthusiasm. Don't believe I've had the pleasure. Harold Pembroke, Cedar Falls Land Office. You look like a man with property on his mind. Ezra shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how out of place he must appear in this civilized setting. Name's McKinnon. I'm looking for something simple. Just a roof and 4 walls. Nothing fancy. Harold's smile widened in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Practical man, I like that. What sort of budget are we working with, Mr. McKinnon? The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Ezra reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a single silver dollar, placing it on the desk with the careful deliberation of a man who understood its significance. "This is what I have," he said quietly. Most land agents would have laughed, or perhaps grown angry at having their time wasted. Harold Pembroke did neither. Instead, he picked up the coin and examined it as if it were a rare treasure, turning it over in his palm with theatrical consideration. "Interesting," Harold murmured. "You know, Mr. McKinnon, it just so happens that I might have something that could work within your budget. There's a property on Elm Street that the owner is quite motivated to sell. Been sitting empty for months, and frankly, it's becoming something of an eyesore." Ezra frowned. In his experience, when something sounded too good to be true, it usually was. "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing that can't be fixed with a little elbow grease," Harold said smoothly. "The previous owner left town rather suddenly, and the house has been unoccupied since. Needs some repair work, but the bones are solid. Built to last." The land agent moved to a large map pinned to the wall, pointing to a spot several blocks from the main commercial district. "Here's the property. 3-bedroom house with a decent-sized lot. Close enough to town for convenience, but far enough away for privacy. Privacy." The word resonated with Ezra in ways Harold probably didn't intend. After 20 years of complete solitude, the idea of privacy and proximity to other people felt like a compromise he could manage. Why would anyone sell a house like that for $1? Ezra asked. Harold's expression flickered for just a moment, so briefly that Ezra almost missed it. Like I said, the owner was motivated. Left some debts behind, and the bank just wants to clear the property off their books. Sometimes a man gets lucky, Mr. McKinnon. Question is, are you ready to take advantage of good fortune when it comes your way? Ezra stared at the map, his mind racing through possibilities and complications. A house in town meant neighbors, meant social obligations, meant the constant presence of other people and their expectations. But it also meant shelter, meant belonging to something larger than his own solitary existence. Meant the possibility of building a life instead of merely surviving one. "I'd like to see it first," he said. Of course. Of course." Harold pulled a key from a drawer and slipped it into his vest pocket. "We can walk over right now if you'd like. Fair warning, though, there might be some temporary residents. Nothing to worry about, just some folks who've been using the place for shelter. They'll move along once the property changes hands." The walk to Elm Street took them through the heart of Cedar Falls. Past the general store, where Ezra recognized the clerk who'd shown him unwanted sympathy. Past the church, where a small cemetery held neat rows of wooden crosses. Past houses with children playing in front yards and women hanging laundry on lines strung between trees. The house at the end of Elm Street stood apart from its neighbors, not just in distance but in character. Where the other homes showed signs of regular maintenance and care, this one sagged slightly under the weight of neglect. The paint had faded and peeled, leaving patches of bare wood exposed to the elements. The front porch tilted at an angle that suggested problems with the foundation, and several shutters hung askew on their hinges, but the structure itself appeared sound. And the lot was generous, with mature trees that would provide shade in summer and windbreak in winter. Ezra could see potential in the bones of the place, could envision what it might become with attention and care. "Like I said, needs some work," Harold said, his tone carefully neutral. "But a man with your obvious skills could turn this into something special." Ezra walked around the perimeter of the house, testing the foundation stones and examining the roofline. The work required would be significant, but not overwhelming. He'd built his mountain cabin with nothing but hand tools and determination. Transforming this place would be luxury by comparison. As they approached the front door, Ezra noticed movement behind one of the upstairs windows, a quick flash of curtain falling back into place. Harold had mentioned temporary residence, but something in the man's manner suggested there was more to the story than he was telling. "The people inside," Ezra said. "How long have they been here?" Harold's hand paused on the key. "Not long. They'll be gone by tomorrow if you decide to take the property. I can guarantee that." There was an edge to Harold's voice that made Ezra's instincts prickle with warning. In the mountains, survival depended on reading the subtle signs that indicated when something was wrong. Harold Pembroke was trying too hard to make this sale happen, and his eagerness suggested motivations beyond simple business. But Ezra was tired of being cautious, tired of letting fear make his decisions for him. He'd spent 2 decades avoiding risk, and what had it gotten him? A cabin in the wilderness, and a soul that felt as empty as the spaces between the mountains. "Let's see the inside," he said. Harold unlocked the door and pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a screech that announced their arrival to anyone within hearing distance. The interior was dim, with most of the windows covered by makeshift curtains or boards. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something that spoke of recent habitation and lives being lived in the shadows. The front room was larger than Ezra had expected, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and built-in shelves that showed the craftsmanship of the original builder. The wooden floors, though dusty and scarred, appeared solid beneath his boots. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of hurried movement and hushed voices. Harold seemed determined to ignore these signs of occupancy, leading Ezra through the downstairs rooms with the patter of a man conducting a routine showing. "Kitchen's through here," Harold said, opening a door to reveal a room with a cast-iron stove and a deep sink beside a window that looked out on the backyard. Previous owner put in some modern conveniences. "Running water from the town system." Ezra nodded absently, his attention focused on the sounds from upstairs. Footsteps moved across the ceiling, and he caught the faint murmur of women's voices engaged in what sounded like urgent conversation. "The temporary residents," he said. "Are they all women?" Harold's smile became strained. "Does it matter? Like I told you, they'll be gone by tomorrow." But Ezra was beginning to suspect that nothing about this situation was as simple as Harold wanted him to believe. The man's obvious discomfort, the suspicious price, the mysterious occupants, it all added up to complications that a wiser man would avoid. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his memory, teasing him about his tendency to complicate simple situations. "Sometimes, Ezra," she used to say, "a man just has to trust that things will work out the way they're meant to." He pulled the silver dollar from his pocket and placed it in Harold's eager palm. "I'll take it," he said. Harold Pembroke disappeared. The moment the money changed hands, muttering something about paperwork and promising to return with the proper documents by evening. He left behind an awkward silence and the distinct impression that Ezra had just purchased. More trouble than shelter. The house felt different with Harold gone. Less like a property showing and more like an intrusion into someone else's private world. Ezra stood in the front hall, listening to the continued sounds of movement upstairs, and wondered if he'd made the first sensible decision of his adult life, or the most foolish. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty spaces. "I know you're up there. I'm the new owner, but I'm not here to throw anyone out into the street." The sounds stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. Then slowly, he heard the creak of floorboards and the whispered conference of people trying to decide whether to trust a stranger. A woman appeared at the top of the stairs, and Ezra's breath caught in his throat. She was perhaps 35. With auburn hair pinned back in a practical bun and intelligent green eyes that assessed him with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to be wary of men's promises. Her dress was well made, but showed signs of careful mending, and she carried herself with the posture of a woman accustomed to facing difficult situations with dignity intact. In her hand, she clutched a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and handling. The address was written in a man's careful script, and Ezra could see that it had been opened and resealed many times, as if the recipient couldn't decide whether to read its contents or preserve the hope that came with leaving it unread. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of an educated Easterner. "I apologize for the circumstances of our meeting, Mr. McKinnon." Ezra McKinnon. He removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his rough appearance in the presence of such obvious refinement. "And there's no need to apologize. From what I can tell, you've been taking better care of this place than whoever owned it before." Eleanor's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. Her fingers tightened around the letter, and Ezra realized it must be from the man who'd brought her west, the man who'd failed to keep his promises. "That's kind of you to say. I suppose you're wondering what we're doing here." "The thought had occurred to me," Ezra admitted. "But I'm more interested in whether you have somewhere else to go. It's getting on toward evening, and I won't have women put out of their shelter on my account." Behind Eleanor, other figures began to appear on the staircase. A young woman with striking dark hair and eyes that held both intelligence and sadness stepped forward with the careful movements of someone ready to flee at a moment's notice. A red-haired woman with freckles and calloused hands that spoke of hard work peered around the banister with open curiosity. Two more women remained partially hidden in the shadows of the upper landing, but their presence added weight to the situation that was rapidly becoming more complex than Ezra had bargained for. "We're mail-order brides," Eleanor said simply, the words carrying a mix of shame and defiance. "Or we're meant to be." Her intended husband seemed to have had second thoughts about their commitments. The words hit Ezra like cold water. Mail-order brides, women who'd traveled across the country based on promises made by men they'd never met, only to find themselves abandoned in a strange place with nowhere to turn. The cruelty of it made his chest tighten with anger on their behalf. "All of you?" he asked. "All of us," confirmed the red-haired woman, stepping fully into view. Her Irish accent was unmistakable, and her chin was raised in a gesture of pride that dared anyone to pity her. "I'm Maggie O'Brien, and these ladies are Rosa Martinez, Beth Patterson, and Catherine Williams. We've been making the best of things here for the past 3 months. Rosa, the dark-haired woman, moved down another step. She was younger than the others, perhaps 24, with the kind of beauty that would have made men fight duels in another time and place. "We tried to find work," she said, her slight accent adding music to her words. "But a woman alone in a frontier town has limited options, and none of them respectable." Beth Patterson appeared to be the youngest of the group, with blonde hair and blue eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who couldn't be more than 22. She clutched a small sewing basket, as if it were a lifeline, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "We've kept the house clean and made what repairs we could. We didn't want to be a burden to anyone." The fifth woman, Catherine, finally stepped into the light, and Ezra immediately understood why the others deferred to her judgment. She was perhaps 30, with dark brown hair and eyes that missed nothing. Her dress was the finest of the group, though it too showed signs of careful maintenance, and she carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions and living with the consequences. "We know this situation is irregular," Catherine said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "We're prepared to leave immediately if that's what you prefer. We've imposed on your property long enough." Ezra looked at the 5 women arrayed on his staircase and felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight bands of caution and self-protection that had kept him isolated for so long. These weren't abstract problems or theoretical difficulties. They were real people who'd been failed by men who'd made promises they couldn't or wouldn't keep. "Where would you go?" he asked. The question hung in the air unanswered, because they all knew there was nowhere to go. A woman alone on the frontier faced choices that ranged from desperate to degrading, and 5 women together faced the same limited options with the added burden of being conspicuous in their numbers. "We'll manage," Eleanor said, but the words lacked conviction. Her grip on the letter loosened, and Ezra caught a glimpse of the return address: Thaddeus Whitmore, Cedar Falls, Colorado Territory. A local man, then, who'd brought these women west and then abandoned them. Ezra thought of Sarah's ring, still wrapped in oiled cloth in his pack upstairs. He thought of 20 years of self-imposed exile, of the deer in the meadow who protected each other instinctively, of the loneliness that had driven him down from the mountains in search of human connection. "This house has 3 bedrooms," he said slowly. 5 women and 1 man could make that work, with proper arrangements. "The house needs considerable repair work, and I could use help with the day-to-day tasks of running a household. If you ladies were willing to contribute your skills in exchange for room and board, it might benefit everyone involved." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and fraught with complications. Ezra could see the women exchanging glances, conducting an entire conversation in the subtle language of people who'd learned to depend on each other for survival. "Mr. McKinnon," Eleanor said carefully, still clutching her unopened letter, "that's a generous offer, but surely you understand how such an arrangement might appear to others. A single man living with 5 unmarried women would cause talk," Ezra finished. "Yes, I imagine it would. But I've spent the last 20 years not caring what people think about my living arrangements, and I'm not inclined to start now." Maggie O'Brien laughed, a sound that transformed her face and revealed the girl she might have been before life taught her to be cautious. "Well, if we're going to shock the good people of Cedar Falls, we might as well do it properly. It's not a decision to make lightly," Catherine warned, though Ezra could see the hope beginning to kindle in her eyes. "We know nothing about Mr. McKinnon except that he bought this house for $1, which raises its own questions." "Fair point," Ezra acknowledged. "I'll tell you what I told the land agent. I've been living alone in the mountains for 20 years. I came to town with $1 and a need for shelter, and I found both. As for my character, you'll have to judge that for yourselves over time." Rosa spoke up from her position on the stairs. "Why did you live alone for so long?" The question was direct and deserved an honest answer, even if it reopened wounds he'd spent 2 decades trying to heal. "I was married once. My wife died of consumption, and I blamed myself for not getting her proper medical care in time. I thought isolation was what I deserved, and now," Eleanor asked softly, the letter still clutched in her hand like a talisman of broken promises. Ezra looked around the room that would become his home, at the women who might become his unlikely family, and felt something he'd forgotten existed. "Possibility. Now I think maybe I was wrong about what I deserved," he said. Eleanor looked down at the letter in her hands, Thaddeus Whitmore's final message. The one she'd been too afraid to read because it might contain confirmations of abandonment she wasn't ready to face. Then with deliberate movements, she tore it in half and let the pieces fall to the floor. "Then perhaps," she said, "we all deserve better than what we've been settling for." The first week at the house on Elm Street revealed just how much Ezra had forgotten about living with other people. Simple things, like the rhythm of morning routines, the negotiation of shared spaces, the gentle chaos of multiple lives intersecting, felt foreign after 2 decades of solitary existence. But it was Maggie's medical bag that truly opened his eyes to what these women had endured. The leather satchel sat on the kitchen table like a testament to resilience, its worn surface polished smooth by years of handling. It belonged to Maggie's father, Dr. Patrick O'Brien, and she'd carried it with her from Ireland to New York to Colorado Territory, through every disappointment and broken promise. The instruments inside were old but well-maintained, and Maggie wielded them with the skill of someone who'd learned medicine at her father's side before. Circumstances forced her into the desperate choice of seeking a husband through newspaper advertisements. "Hold still now," Maggie said, cleaning a gash on Ezra's palm, where he'd cut himself on a broken piece of window glass during his morning inspection of the house's many needs. Her hands were steady and sure as she cleaned the wound with careful precision. "You're fortunate it's not deeper. This glass has been broken for months. Could have been much worse." Rosa looked up from the corner where she was cataloguing the tools they'd need for repairs. "The window in the front bedroom broke during the last storm. We covered it with oilcloth, but it's not a permanent solution. Nothing about this situation is permanent, Catherine reminded them from her position at the stove, where she was attempting to coax heat from a temperamental firebox. We're guests here, and we shouldn't forget that. Ezra winced as Maggie applied antiseptic to his cut, more from her words than the sting of the medicine. You're not guests, he said firmly. If we're going to make this work, you need to think of this place as home. Eleanor entered the kitchen, carrying a slate board covered with careful calculations. She'd taken it upon herself to assess their combined resources and plan for the coming weeks, approaching the task with the methodical precision of someone trained to organize complex information. Based on what we discussed last night, she said, setting the slate on the table beside Maggie's medical bag, we have enough combined funds to cover basic supplies for perhaps 6 weeks, assuming we're careful. After that, we'll need to find additional sources of income. What about the work you've been doing? Ezra asked. The teaching, the medical calls, the translation work? It's irregular, Eleanor admitted. And some of it may dry up once word spreads about our living arrangements. There are people in this town who wouldn't want their children taught by a woman living in sin. We're not living in sin, Beth said quietly from the corner where she was mending a tear in one of the kitchen curtains. Her needle moved with practiced efficiency, transforming damaged fabric into something whole again. We're living in hope. Maggie finished bandaging Ezra's hand and began packing her instruments back into the leather bag with ritual care. Hope doesn't pay for flour and lamp oil, love. We'll need something more substantial if we're going to make this work long-term. A knock at the front door interrupted their planning session. Through the front window, Ezra could see a well-dressed man on horseback, accompanied by 2 other riders who looked more like hired muscle than casual visitors. Were you expecting anyone? Catherine asked, her business instincts immediately alert to potential trouble. No one knows I'm here, except Harold Pembroke, Ezra replied. But even as he said it, he realized that Harold's absence since the sale suggested complications beyond simple paperwork delays. Eleanor peered through the curtain and stepped back with obvious alarm. That's Cornelius Blackwood. He owns the biggest ranch in the county, along with half the businesses in town. What would he want here? Rosa asked. Nothing good, Maggie said, closing her medical bag with a decisive snap. Men like that don't make social calls on people like us. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Ezra straightened his shoulders and walked to the door, acutely aware of the women watching from the kitchen doorway. He opened it to reveal a man of perhaps 50, impeccably dressed, despite the dust of the trail, with cold eyes that assessed everything in terms of value and acquisition. Mr. McKinnon, I presume. Blackwood's voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to deference. I'm Cornelius Blackwood. I believe we need to discuss your recent property acquisition. I wasn't aware there was anything to discuss, Ezra replied, though he kept his tone civil. The sale was completed yesterday. Ah, but that's where you're mistaken. Blackwood produced a rolled document from his saddlebag, his smile sharp as a blade. You see, there was an existing agreement on this property, a prior claim that supersedes any sale Harold Pembroke might have arranged. Ezra's blood began to run cold as he recognized the setup for what it was. What kind of prior claim? A contract for services rendered, Blackwood said smoothly. This house has been serving as temporary housing for certain ladies who were unable to fulfill their contracted obligations. The cost of that housing, along with interest, comes to considerably more than the dollar you paid. Behind Ezra, he heard Eleanor's sharp intake of breath. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Harold's eagerness to sell, the women's mysterious abandonment, and now Blackwood's convenient appearance with legal documents. I think you'd better explain yourself more clearly, Ezra said. Blackwood's smile widened. These ladies entered into arrangements to marry upstanding members of our community. When those arrangements fell through, due to various inadequacies on their part, they became a burden on the town's resources. I've been generously providing them with shelter in exchange for eventual compensation. That's a lie, Eleanor said, stepping forward with more courage than caution. We paid rent when we could, and we've maintained this property better than it's been kept in years, according to my records," Blackwood said. "Consulting his documents, you owe 3 months back rent, plus damage, plus interest. The total comes to $250. The sum was staggering, more money than any of them had seen in years." Ezra began to understand the trap that had been laid with surgical precision. The women had been stranded here deliberately, accumulating debt that could never be repaid, creating a situation that would force them into whatever terms Blackwood chose to dictate. "And if we can't pay?" Ezra asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Then the ladies will need to work off their debt through alternative arrangements," Blackwood said, his meaning unmistakably clear. "I operate several businesses that could use their services. As for you, Mr. McKinnon, your purchase of this property was invalid due to the existing liens. You'll need to vacate immediately." Catherine stepped up beside Eleanor, her ledger book clutched in her hands like a weapon. "Show us the original rental agreements," she demanded. "If we owe this money, there should be documentation." Blackwood's confidence never wavered. The agreements were verbal but witnessed. "I have 3 men who will testify to the terms." The 2 riders behind Blackwood touched their hat brims in mock courtesy, their smiles confirming their willingness to provide whatever testimony their employer required. Ezra felt the familiar weight of failure settling on his shoulders. He'd come to town seeking connection and found it, only to discover that his attempt to help had made everything worse. These women would now face a choice between destitution and degradation. And it was his fault for walking into a situation he should have. Understood was too good to be true, but then he noticed something in the women's bearing. They weren't cowering or preparing to submit to Blackwood's demands. Instead, they were drawing closer together, presenting a united front that spoke of hard-won solidarity. Maggie stepped forward, her medical bag still in her hand. "Mr. Blackwood, I believe you're suffering from a severe case of mistaken identity. These ladies are under my professional care for various ailments, and I cannot recommend the stress of relocation at this time. And as their educational consultant," Eleanor added smoothly, "I must point out several legal irregularities in your documentation that would require review by a qualified attorney." Rosa moved to the window and began speaking rapidly in Spanish to someone outside, except there was no one outside to hear her. The effect, however, was to suggest that reinforcements might be coming. Beth continued her sewing with deliberate calm, as if armed men making threats were merely an interruption to her daily routine. Catherine opened her ledger and began making notes with the focused attention of someone, preparing for a lengthy legal battle. Blackwood's confidence flickered for the first time as he realized he was facing organized resistance rather than helpless victims. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "I have considerable influence in this town. Cross me, and you'll find life very difficult indeed." "Mr. Blackwood," Ezra said quietly, "I think you're the one making the mistake. These ladies are under my protection now, and this property belongs to me. If you have legal claims to make, I suggest you take them up with a judge rather than trying to intimidate women on their own doorstep." The rancher's mask slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath his polished exterior. "You have no idea what you're involving yourself in, McKinnon. This isn't over." "No," Ezra agreed, "I don't think it is." As Blackwood and his men rode away, the women gathered around Ezra in the kitchen. Maggie's medical bag sat open on the table, its instruments glinting in the afternoon light, tools for healing that had become symbols of their determination to survive whatever came next. "Well," Eleanor said, "I suppose we're committed now." "We were committed the moment we decided to trust each other," Catherine replied, making a final note in her ledger. "The question is what we do next." Ezra looked around at their faces, determined, frightened, but not defeated, and felt something he'd forgotten since Sarah's death, the fierce protectiveness that came with having people to defend. "Next," he said, "we figure out what Blackwood's really after and why he's so determined to get rid of us. A man doesn't go to this much trouble unless there's something here worth having." Maggie closed her medical bag with a decisive snap. Then we'd better find it before he does. Rosa's grandmother's recipe book revealed secrets that went far beyond cooking. The leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and filled with careful Spanish script, had traveled from Mexico to Colorado territory in Rosa's traveling trunk. But as the household settled into its routines over the following days, it became clear that the recipes were just the beginning of what Rosa had inherited. "Mira," Rosa said, pointing to a page filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting as she prepared breakfast for the 6 of them. "This is not just how to make tortillas. See here, she writes about which herbs grow where, when to plant them, how to preserve them through winter." Eleanor looked over her shoulder, fascinated by the mix of practical knowledge and folk wisdom contained in the book. "Your grandmother was a healer?" "Curandera," Rosa confirmed, turning the page to reveal pressed flowers and detailed drawings of plants. "She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. The knowledge goes back generations." The morning routine had become a dance of domestic efficiency that surprised Ezra with its naturalness. Catherine managed the household accounts at the kitchen table, while Rosa prepared meals that somehow stretched their meager supplies into satisfying abundance. Eleanor corrected essays from her reading students by the front window, where the light was best, and Beth sat in the corner with her sewing, transforming worn fabric into useful household items. Maggie had gone into town early to tend to a miner's injured arm, taking her medical bag and returning with both payment and gossip. The combination of her Irish warmth and medical skill had made her popular among the working men of Cedar Falls. Despite the scandal of her living arrangement, "Mrs. Henderson at the general store says there's talk," Maggie reported as she hung her shawl by the door. "Some of the church ladies are organizing to have us run out of town for corrupting public morals." "What kind of talk?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "The predictable kind. A man living with 5 women, none of them married to him. They're calling it a den of iniquity, and worse." Maggie's tone was matter-of-fact, but Ezra could see the worry in her eyes. Catherine looked up from her ledger. "How much worse can our reputation get? We're already abandoned mail-order brides, living in a broken-down house. It can get worse when it starts affecting our ability to earn money," Eleanor pointed out. "2 of my students' mothers have already cancelled their lessons." Rosa turned from the stove, where she was stirring a pot that filled the kitchen with savory aromas. "What does your book say about dealing with hostile neighbors?" she asked, nodding toward her grandmother's recipe collection. "Abuela always said the best defense against gossip was to make yourself indispensable," Rosa replied, flipping through the pages. "Feed people, heal them, help them solve their problems. Hard to run off someone you need." Beth looked up from her sewing with a shy smile. "Mrs. Patterson, no relation, just the same name, asked if I could alter her daughter's wedding dress. It's too long and needs taking in at the waist." "That's something," Catherine said, making a note in her accounts. "Wedding work pays better than regular mending." Ezra had been listening to their conversation while examining the latest problem the house had presented. A leak in the kitchen ceiling that was getting worse with each rain. The water damage suggested the roof needed more than simple patching, but the supplies for a proper repair would cost money they didn't have. "I've been thinking about what Blackwood said," he announced, setting down the piece of damaged ceiling plaster he'd been examining, "about prior claims and existing agreements. There's something about this whole situation that doesn't make sense." "You mean, besides the coincidence of a house being sold for $1? Catherine asked dryly. "Exactly. Harold Pembroke was too eager to make that sale, and Blackwood was too quick to appear with legal documents. It feels orchestrated." Eleanor set down her student papers and gave him her full attention. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Harold and Blackwood are working together, and this house is more valuable than it appears. Why else would Blackwood care so much about a rundown property on the edge of town?" Maggie crossed to the window and peered out at the overgrown garden behind the house. "What if it's not about the house at all? What if it's about the land?" "The railroad," Rosa said suddenly, looking up from her grandmother's book with dawning realization. "I heard men talking at the bank when I was translating. Something about a new rail line coming through the territory. The pieces began to click together in Ezra's mind. A railroad would need right-of-way through the town, and property that seemed worthless now could become extremely valuable if it happened to sit in the path of progress. That would explain the setup, Catherine said, her business instincts sharp as ever. Get us into debt we can't pay, force us out, then acquire the property cheaply before the railroad announcement becomes public. But why go to such elaborate lengths? Beth asked. Couldn't they just buy the property legitimately? Not if the current owner wouldn't sell, Eleanor replied, or if they needed to keep the real reason secret until they'd acquired all the land they needed. Rosa closed her grandmother's book and stood with decision. Then we don't give it to them. It's not that simple, Ezra warned. Blackwood has money, influence, and apparently no scruples about how he uses either. We're 5 women and 1 man with barely enough resources to last the month. 6 people who've already survived things that should have broken us, Maggie corrected. I've seen what we can do when we work together. Eleanor stood and began pacing the kitchen, her teacher's mind working through possibilities. We need more information. If we're right about the railroad, there will be surveys, legal filings, correspondence. Blackwood can't keep something that big completely secret, and we need allies, Catherine added. Other people in town who would be hurt by Blackwood's schemes. Beth held up the dress she'd been mending, a simple house dress transformed by her skilled needlework into something that looked almost elegant. Sometimes the best way to fight power is to refuse to be intimidated by it. Keep doing what you're doing, but do it better. Rosa nodded toward her grandmother's book. Abuela used to say that the strongest walls are built 1 stone at a time. We make ourselves part of this community, 1 person at a time. Over the next week, they put their plan into action with the quiet determination of people who'd learned to fight for survival. Rosa began growing herbs from her grandmother's seeds in the back garden, creating remedies that complemented Maggie's medical knowledge. Eleanor expanded her teaching to include adult literacy classes for miners' wives. Beth's sewing skills became known throughout the town as word spread about the miracle she'd worked with Mrs. Patterson's wedding dress. Catherine took her business acumen to the next level, offering to help other women manage their household accounts and understand contracts. Her ledger book became a symbol of female financial independence that both inspired and threatened the established order. Ezra threw himself into repairing the house with a vigor he hadn't felt in years. Each fixed board and sealed window was both an improvement to their shelter and a statement of permanent intention. He wasn't just patching a roof. He was building a home. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, from the general store, the same woman, who'd been spreading gossip about their living arrangement, appeared at their doctor on a rainy Thursday afternoon with a problem that overrode her moral concerns. "It's my Arthur," she said, wringing her hands as she stood dripping on their front porch. "He's been coughing something fierce for weeks, and Doc Morrison says there's nothing more he can do. I heard tell that Miss Rosa knows something about healing herbs." Rosa appeared at Eleanor's shoulder, her grandmother's book in her hands. "Bring him in from the rain, Signora. Let's see what we can do." What followed was a careful collaboration between Rosa's traditional knowledge and Maggie's medical training. They examined Arthur Henderson's symptoms, consulted both the recipe book and Maggie's medical texts, and prepared a treatment that combined the best of both approaches. "It's an old remedy," Rosa explained, as she brewed a tea from herbs grown in their garden. "Good for chest congestion and lung inflammation. But Maggie says we should also steam the airways and keep him warm and rested." Mrs. Henderson watched their careful ministrations with growing amazement and grudging respect. "You ladies certainly seem to know what you're about. We've learned to take care of each other," Eleanor said simply. "It comes naturally when you're family." "Family," Mrs. Henderson repeated, as if the word had taken on new meaning. "I suppose it is, isn't it? Not the traditional kind, but family all the same." By the time Arthur Henderson's cough had cleared up, which it did dramatically, within 3 days, word had spread throughout Cedar Falls about the unusual household on Elm Street. Not all of it was positive, but increasingly it was respectful. The women weren't just scandalous refugees anymore. They were useful members of the community with skills that people needed. But their growing acceptance also drew Blackwood's attention. The rancher appeared at their door again on a Friday evening, this time without his hired muscle, but with legal documents that looked far more official than his previous threats. "I see you've been making yourselves at home," he said, his smile cold as winter wind. "How fortunate that you've had this time to settle in, because I'm afraid it's about to end." Catherine appeared beside Ezra, her ledger book under her arm like armor. "More phantom debts, Mr. Blackwood?" "Not phantom at all, Miss Williams. I have a court order here requiring you to vacate this property pending resolution of ownership disputes. Seems there are questions about the legality of Mr. McKinnon's purchase." Ezra took the document and read it carefully, his heart sinking as he recognized official legal language that would be expensive and time-consuming to challenge. "You have 3 days," Blackwood continued. "After that, the sheriff will remove you by force if necessary." As he rode away, the 6 of them gathered in the kitchen around Rosa's grandmother's recipe book, which seemed to have become their talisman of hope and resistance. 3 days, Eleanor said quietly. 3 days to find proof that this is all a setup. Catherine amended. Rosa opened the book to a page near the back, where her grandmother had written advice about dealing with enemies. "Abuela says here that sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything to save what matters most." "And what matters most?" Maggie asked. Rosa looked around at their faces. 5 women and 1 man who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something worth defending. "This," she said simply. "All of this. Beth's sewing kit had belonged to her mother, and then her mother's mother before that. The small wooden box with its neat compartments for threads, needles, and tiny scissors had traveled from Pennsylvania to Colorado territory in Beth's single carpet bag, representing the only inheritance she'd received from a family that had died too young and left her with nothing but skill and determination. Now, as she worked by lamplight in the front parlor, transforming scraps of fabric into something beautiful, the sewing kit had become a symbol of hope for all of them. "Mrs. Patterson's daughter isn't the only bride in town who needs alterations," Eleanor observed, watching Beth's nimble fingers work tiny, perfect stitches along a seam. "Word is spreading about your skill." Beth looked up from her work, a wedding dress for the banker's niece that would pay more than any of them had earned in weeks. "Mrs. Chen at the laundry says her daughter is getting married next month. The family doesn't have much money, but they want something special. Every woman deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day," Rosa said from the kitchen, where she was preparing their evening meal, with ingredients that had been gifts from grateful patients, rich or poor. The past month had seen a gradual shift in how the town viewed their unusual household. What had begun as scandal was slowly transforming into grudging respect, largely due to their unwavering commitment to helping anyone who needed their services. Rosa's herb garden had produced remedies for everything from arthritis to infant colic. Maggie's medical expertise had saved 2 lives and countless limbs. Eleanor's literacy classes had given dozens of adults the ability to read their first book, but success brought its own complications. As Ezra was learning from his conversation with Sheriff Morrison, "I'm not saying I agree with Blackwood's methods," the sheriff said, sitting awkwardly in their front parlor with his hat in his hands. "But the law is the law, and that court order is legal. You folks have until tomorrow evening to vacate." Ezra studied the man's weathered face, seeing the conflict between duty and conscience. Morrison had been sheriff of Cedar Falls for 15 years, long enough to understand the difference between legal and right. What if we could prove the court order was obtained through fraud? Catherine asked from her chair by the window, her ledger open as always. "Would that change anything?" "Proof of fraud would certainly complicate matters," Morrison admitted. "But you'd need more than suspicion. You'd need documents, witnesses, something concrete." "What about Harold Pembroke?" Eleanor asked. "He's the one who sold us the house. Surely his testimony would carry weight." The sheriff's expression grew uncomfortable. "Harold left town 3 days ago. Sudden family emergency back east, according to the note he left. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, and they all knew it. Harold Pembroke had been paid to disappear, eliminating the one person who could testify to the real circumstances of the house sale. "What happens if we refuse to leave?" Maggie asked bluntly. "Then I'll have to remove you by force," Morrison replied. "And none of us wants that." After the sheriff left, they gathered around the kitchen table where Beth's sewing kit sat open beside Catherine's ledger and Rosa's recipe book. The three objects represented their combined skills and resources, everything they had to fight with, against Blackwood's money and influence. "We need help," Catherine said simply. "More than we can provide for ourselves." "Who would help us?" Beth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're still outsiders here, no matter how many people we've helped." "There's one person who might," Eleanor said slowly. "Judge Preston's wife came to my literacy class last week. She mentioned that her husband is concerned about Blackwood's growing influence in the county." Ezra felt a spark of hope. "Judge Preston could review the court order, maybe find legal grounds to challenge it." "If he would," Rosa cautioned. "And if there's time." They were discussing their options when a soft knock came at the back door, unusual since visitors typically used the front entrance. Eleanor answered it to find Mrs. Chen standing in the gathering dusk, her face tight with worry. "Please," the Chinese woman said in careful English. "My husband, he is hurt. Very bad." The next hour was a whirlwind of activity that pushed all thoughts of legal troubles aside. Mrs. Chen's husband had been injured in an accident at the laundry, his arm badly burned by scalding water and caught in the machinery. Rosa and Maggie worked together to treat the extensive wounds, while Eleanor helped translate when language barriers complicated communication. Beth contributed by sitting with Mrs. Chen, her presence somehow calming the distraught woman without need for words. Her sewing kit lay forgotten on the kitchen table as she focused entirely on offering comfort through the universal language of compassion. "He'll live," Maggie announced finally, washing blood from her hands. "But it's going to be a long recovery. He won't be able to work for weeks, maybe months." Mrs. Chen began to weep, not from relief, but from despair. No work, no money. How we eat, how we pay rent. It was Catherine who provided the solution, opening her ledger to a page covered with careful calculations. "You don't worry about rent right now. Mr. Blackwood can wait for his money." "Blackwood?" Ezra asked sharply. "He owns most of the commercial buildings in Chinatown," Catherine explained, "including the laundry. I've been tracking property ownership as part of trying to understand his business interests. The implications hit them all at once. Blackwood wasn't just trying to acquire their house, he was systematically taking control of property throughout Cedar Falls, using debt and legal manipulation to force out anyone who couldn't fight back. "How many other people is he doing this to?" Eleanor asked. Catherine flipped through her ledger, revealing pages of notes about property transfers, mysterious debts, and businesses that had suddenly changed ownership. "Near as I can tell, at least 20 families in the past 2 years. Always the same pattern: create a debt, use legal pressure, acquire property at below-market prices." "That's not business," Rosa said angrily. "That's theft." "Legal theft," Maggie corrected grimly. "The worst kind." As they helped Mrs. Chen get her husband home, Ezra found himself thinking about the deer he'd watched from his mountain cabin, how they protected each other instinctively when danger threatened. The people of Cedar Falls were facing a predator, but they were scattered and vulnerable, picked off one by one because they didn't understand the scope of the threat. "We need to warn people," he said as they walked back to their house through the quiet streets. "Warn them about what?" Eleanor asked. "That a wealthy, influential man is using legal methods to acquire property? Most people would say that's just business." "Then we need to show them it's more than that," Catherine said, clutching her ledger protectively. "Document the pattern, connect the dots, make it impossible to ignore." Beth had been quiet during their walk, but now she spoke up with surprising conviction. "My mother used to say that the way to defeat a bully was to make sure he couldn't pick on people one at a time anymore. Make them stand together. Easier said than done, Maggie pointed out. These people barely know each other, and they're all struggling just to survive. They know us, Rosa said quietly. We've helped most of them at one time or another. They trust us. Back at the house, they spread Catherine's ledger out on the kitchen table alongside maps of the town and county. Beth's sewing kit sat in the center like a compass, its neat compartments and careful organization somehow symbolizing the precision they would need to succeed. Look at this pattern, Catherine said, tracing property boundaries with her finger. All the land he's acquired forms a rough line from the river to the hills east of town. If you were planning a railroad route, this would be exactly the path you'd need. So our guess was right, Eleanor said. He's assembling right-of-way for the railroad before the route becomes public knowledge. Which means he's probably got inside information, Ezra added. Someone connected to the railroad company, maybe even someone in the territorial government. That's a serious accusation, Maggie warned. The kind that could get us in more trouble than we're already in. We're already facing eviction tomorrow, Rosa pointed out. How much more trouble could we be in? Beth looked up from the sewing she'd resumed, her hands never idle even during crisis. What if we're thinking about this wrong? What if instead of fighting Blackwood directly, we find a way to make his schemes public before he can complete them? How? Catherine asked. By helping his victims tell their stories, Eleanor said, understanding beginning to dawn. If people knew what was really happening, they'd stand together instead of falling alone, Rosa finished. It was a plan born of desperation and hope in equal measure, but as they worked through the night, it began to take shape. They would use their final day before eviction to gather testimonies from Blackwood's victims, document the pattern of his land grabbing, and present the evidence to Judge Preston in hopes of stopping not just their eviction, but the entire scheme. Beth's sewing kit remained open on the table as they planned, its contents gleaming in the lamplight like tools of war rather than instruments of creation. But perhaps, Ezra thought as he watched her careful fingers work thread into patterns, that would become something beautiful. That was exactly what they were. We'll need to move fast, Catherine said, making final notes in her ledger. One day to gather evidence, present it to the judge and hope for the best. One day to save not just our home, Eleanor added, but our neighbors as well. Rosa closed her grandmother's recipe book and stood with decision. Then we'd better not waste any time sleeping. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, the six of them prepared to face their greatest challenge yet. Beth carefully packed her sewing kit, not knowing when or if she would have the chance to use it again in the home they'd built together. But the tools themselves remained ready, and sometimes that was all a person could ask for, to be ready when the moment came, to create something beautiful from the scraps life had given them. Catherine's business ledger had grown from a simple record of household expenses into something far more powerful, a detailed map of corruption that reached into every corner of Cedar Falls. As the final day before their eviction dawned, the leather-bound book had become their most potent weapon against Blackwood's schemes. 17 families, Catherine announced, her finger tracing columns of carefully recorded data. 17 families in 2 years, all following the same pattern. Mysterious debts appear, legal pressure mounts, property changes hands for well below market value. Eleanor looked up from the testimony she was transcribing, Mrs. Chen's account of her husband's accident and the suspicious timing of increased rent demands. The railroad route? Exactly, Catherine confirmed. Every single property sits along the proposed line from the river to Eagle Pass. Blackwood's been assembling the right-of-way piece by piece, using legal manipulation to keep costs low. They had worked through the night, gathering evidence with the methodical precision of investigators. Rosa had used her connections in the Spanish-speaking community to uncover 3 more families who'd been targeted. Maggie's medical rounds had provided access to patients willing to share their stories of financial pressure and mysterious legal troubles. Beth had listened with her gift for making people comfortable enough to reveal painful truths, but it was Catherine's ledger that tied everything together, revealing the scope of Blackwood's ambitions in neat columns of figures that told a story of systematic theft disguised as legitimate business. "The question is whether Judge Preston will see it the same way," Ezra said, reviewing the documents they'd prepared. "Rich men have been taking advantage of poor ones since the world began. What makes this different?" "The railroad connection," Eleanor replied. "If we can prove Blackwood had inside information about the route, that's fraud on a territorial level. It becomes more than just local business disputes." Maggie entered from the kitchen with coffee for everyone, her medical bag at her side as always. "Dr. Morrison let slip something interesting when I was helping with young Tommy Fletcher's broken arm. Seems there was a surveyor in town 3 months ago, staying at the hotel and asking questions about property lines." "Before or after the eviction started?" Catherine asked, already reaching for her pen. "Before. About a week before the Henderson family lost their farm." Catherine made a note, adding another piece to the puzzle. "If we can find that surveyor, get him to testify about what he was surveying and who hired him, we might have enough," Eleanor finished. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning. Through the front window they could see Sheriff Morrison riding up with 2 deputies, their faces grim with reluctance. "They're early," Beth observed quietly, her sewing kit clutched protectively in her lap. "Or right on time," Ezra replied, "depending on how you count the deadline." Sheriff Morrison's knock was gentle but official. When Eleanor opened the door, he touched his hat brim with obvious regret. "Miss Hartwell, Mr. McKinnon, I'm afraid I need to begin the eviction process." "Judge's orders." "Sheriff," Ezra said, "we'd like to present new evidence to Judge Preston before you proceed. Evidence that suggests the court order was obtained through fraudulent means." Morrison's expression grew cautious. "What kind of evidence?" Catherine stepped forward with her ledger open to pages covered with damning documentation. "Proof that Cornelius Blackwood has been systematically defrauding property owners throughout the county, as part of a larger scheme involving inside. Information about railroad development." The sheriff studied the neat columns of figures, his frown deepening as the implications became clear. "These are serious accusations, Miss Williams." "Supported by serious evidence," Eleanor added, indicating the stack of sworn testimonies they'd gathered. 17 families willing to testify about identical patterns of harassment and illegal seizure. "Judge Preston needs to see this," Rosa said, her grandmother's recipe book tucked under her arm like a talisman. "Before more people lose their homes to this man's greed." Sheriff Morrison looked at his deputies, then back at the evidence before him. The conflict between duty and justice played across his weathered features like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "I can give you 2 hours," he said finally. "Time to present your evidence to Judge Preston. After that, with or without his approval, I have to execute this eviction order." 2 hours, Catherine said, checking her pocket watch. That should be enough." But as they prepared to leave for the courthouse, Cornelius Blackwood appeared in their front yard with a dozen armed men, his smile as cold as winter wind. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his tone conversational despite the obvious threat represented by his entourage. "I do hope you're not planning to waste Judge Preston's time with wild accusations and conspiracy theories. We're planning to present evidence of your criminal activities," Eleanor replied, her schoolteacher's authority undimmed by the guns surrounding them. Blackwood's laugh was genuinely amused. "Criminal activities? My dear woman, everything I've done has been perfectly legal. Documented, witnessed, approved by proper authorities." "Legal doesn't mean right," Maggie said, stepping beside Eleanor with her medical bag in hand. "And it doesn't mean permanent, but it does mean enforceable," Blackwood countered. "And I'm afraid I can't allow you to disrupt the orderly transfer of property with unfounded allegations." Catherine clutched her ledger tighter, understanding that all their careful documentation meant nothing if they couldn't get it before a judge. "You can't stop us from seeking legal remedy, can't I?" Blackwood gestured to his men, who moved to block the path to town. "These gentlemen are here to ensure that the eviction proceeds without incident. For public safety, you understand." The trap was elegantly simple. Use the threat of violence to prevent them from presenting evidence that would expose the legal violence Blackwood had been perpetrating for years. Without access to Judge Preston, their careful investigation would remain mere accusation. But Ezra had spent 20 years in the mountains, learning to read situations and find alternatives when obvious paths were blocked. "Rosa," he said quietly, "is there another way into town?" Rosa nodded slightly, understanding his meaning. "Idzi, through the Chen family's property, then along the creek bed. Maggie, how long would it take you to reach Dr. Morrison's office from there?" 10 minutes, maybe 15. Do it. Tell him what's happening here. Ask him to get word to Judge Preston that we're being prevented from presenting evidence by force." But Blackwood had been listening, and his smile widened. "Mr. McKinnon, surely you don't think I'd overlook such obvious routes of communication. Dr. Morrison is currently dealing with a medical emergency at the mine, a terrible accident that will require his full attention for hours." The depth of Blackwood's planning was becoming clear. He'd orchestrated not just their eviction, but a complete isolation that would prevent any interference with his schemes. "You've thought of everything," Catherine said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I've learned that success requires attention to detail," Blackwood replied. "Now, if you'll please gather your belongings, these gentlemen will escort you to the town limits." It was Beth who broke the stalemate, her quiet voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Mr. Blackwood, do you know what my mother taught me about bullies?" The rancher's attention focused on the youngest member of their group with predatory interest. "Please, enlighten me." "She taught me that they only have power as long as people let them stand alone." Beth stood up from the porch steps where she'd been sitting, her sewing kit in her hands. "But look around you, Mr. Blackwood. Do you see anyone standing alone here?" As if summoned by her words, people began appearing from unexpected directions. Mrs. Henderson from the general store came up the front walk with her husband Arthur, both carrying signs that read "Justice for All." The Chen family approached from the side yard, Mr. Chen's bandaged arm in a sling, but his expression determined. Dr. Morrison appeared, despite Blackwood's claims about mining accidents, his medical bag in one hand and a legal document in the other. "What is this?" Blackwood demanded, his composure cracking for the first time. "This is what happens when you pick on people one too many times," Sheriff Morrison said, riding up with Judge Preston himself beside him. "Word has a way of getting around, Blackwood, especially when you've hurt as many families as you have." Judge Preston, a stern man in his 60s, with eyes like chips of flint, surveyed the scene with obvious displeasure. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand there are some questions about the methods used to obtain the court order against these residents." "Your Honor," Blackwood began, "these people are simply trying to avoid legitimate debts." "These people," Eleanor interrupted, stepping forward with their carefully documented evidence, "are trying to expose a pattern of fraud that has victimized dozens of families in your jurisdiction." Catherine opened her ledger and began reading names and dates, each entry representing a family that had lost property to Blackwood's schemes. The crowd grew larger as she spoke, more victims appearing to add their voices to the growing chorus of accusation. 17 families, Catherine concluded, all following identical patterns of mysterious debt, legal pressure, and forced sales. All properties lying along the proposed railroad route that Mr. Blackwood somehow knew about months before the route was made public. Judge Preston's expression grew darker with each revelation. "Mr. Blackwood, these are serious allegations. I think we need to discuss this matter in my chambers immediately." "Your Honor," Blackwood protested, "this is clearly a coordinated attack by disgruntled tenants." "What this is," the judge interrupted, "is evidence of systematic fraud that demands immediate investigation. Sheriff Morrison, I'm temporarily suspending all eviction orders related to Mr. Blackwood's property claims, pending a full review of these allegations." The crowd cheered. But Catherine wasn't finished. She opened her ledger to the final page, where she'd recorded her most damning discovery. Your Honor, there's one more thing. According to territorial records, the survey that provided Mr. Blackwood with advanced knowledge of the railroad route was commissioned by his own company. He didn't just use inside information, he created it by paying for the survey himself, then used that information to defraud property owners who had no way of knowing their land would become valuable. The silence that followed was broken only by Blackwood's sharp intake of breath. Even his hired guns seemed to understand that their employer's situation had become untenable. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Preston said quietly, "you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of legal process. Sheriff, please escort this gentleman to jail while I review these documents more carefully." As Blackwood was led away, his empire of legal manipulation crumbling around him, the 6 residents of the house on Elm Street found themselves surrounded by neighbors who were no longer strangers, but allies in a shared struggle for justice. Catherine closed her ledger with satisfaction, its pages having served their purpose in ways she'd never imagined when she first began keeping careful records. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice was simply paying attention to the details and refusing to let them be ignored. "Well," Eleanor said, looking around at their impromptu celebration, "I suppose we won't be evicted today after all." "No," Ezra agreed, feeling something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, the deep satisfaction that came from protecting people he cared about. "I don't think we will." Rosa opened her grandmother's recipe book to a page about celebration meals, already planning how to feed the crowd that had gathered in their defense. Beth unpacked her sewing kit, ready to begin mending not just fabric, but the social bonds that Blackwood had tried to tear apart. And Catherine opened her ledger to a fresh page, ready to document whatever came next in their unlikely story of found family and hard-won justice. Harold Pembroke's confession letter arrived 3 days after Blackwood's arrest, delivered by a mud-spattered rider who'd tracked them down from Denver with the urgency of a man carrying dynamite. The envelope was thick with pages, sealed with wax that had been pressed with Harold's signet ring, and addressed to the residents of 47 Elm Street, Cedar Falls, with my deepest apologies. Eleanor opened it at the kitchen table while the others gathered around, their morning routine forgotten in the face of this unexpected development. Catherine had her ledger ready to record whatever revelations the letter might contain, while Rosa kept one hand on her grandmother's recipe book as if drawing strength from its familiar presence. "My dear friends," Eleanor read aloud, "for I hope you will allow me to call you friends, despite the terrible wrong I have done you. By the time you read this, I will be far from Colorado territory, but my conscience will not allow me to remain silent about my role in Cornelius Blackwood's schemes." "Go on," Maggie urged when Eleanor paused, her medical training making her impatient with suspense when diagnosis was needed. Eleanor continued reading, her voice growing steadier as the full scope of Harold's revelations became clear. "I was never a land agent by training or inclination. I was a clerk in Blackwood's employ, tasked with creating the appearance of legitimate property transactions while facilitating his acquisition of railroad right-of-way. The house on Elm Street was never truly for sale. It was a trap designed to discredit you ladies and provide legal justification for your removal." "We knew that much," Beth said quietly, her sewing basket in her lap, though her hands remained still. "What we didn't know was the rest of it." Eleanor's eyes widened as she read further. "According to this, Blackwood didn't just have advanced knowledge of the railroad route. He was working directly with railroad executives to determine the route based on which properties he could acquire most cheaply." "That's not just fraud," Catherine said, making rapid notes in her ledger. "That's conspiracy at the territorial level, possibly federal." "There's more," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Harold says here that you ladies were specifically chosen as targets because your status as abandoned mail-order brides made you vulnerable to legal pressure. Blackwood researched each of your backgrounds and arranged for your intended husbands to disappear or renege on their commitments. The silence that followed was like the hush before a thunderstorm. Rosa's hand tightened on her grandmother's book until her knuckles went white. Maggie set down her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly with controlled rage. "He destroyed our lives deliberately," Rosa said finally, her voice carrying the weight of months of uncertainty and fear. "Not as collateral damage to his business schemes, but as a specific strategy. The wedding dress orders that never came," Beth whispered. "The students whose parents suddenly decided they didn't need reading lessons. The medical calls that stopped coming. None of it was random." Eleanor continued reading, though her voice now carried the strain of revelations too large for comfortable comprehension. Harold provides specific details about each arranged abandonment. Thaddeus Whitmore, who was supposed to marry me, was paid $500 to leave town before my arrival. The mining foreman who promised to marry Maggie never existed. Blackwood hired an actor to write letters from a fictional identity, and Rosa's rancher. Catherine asked, though she seemed to already know the answer. Married to Blackwood's niece and living in California. He never had any intention of taking a second wife. The morning light streaming through their kitchen windows seemed dimmer now, shadowed by the realization that their months of struggle and uncertainty had been orchestrated by a man who saw human suffering as merely another business expense. Ezra, who had been listening in increasingly dark silence, finally spoke. "What about Beth and Catherine? Their situations?" Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she turned to the next page of Harold's confession. Beth's merchant was real, but Blackwood bought his debts and forced him into bankruptcy before she arrived. Catherine's business partner was working for Blackwood from the beginning. The boarding house investment was designed to fail and leave her stranded. "So all of it," Maggie said with clinical precision, "every single disappointment and betrayal that brought us together, was planned by one man who needed us desperate enough to accept illegal housing and vulnerable enough to be easily evicted when the time came. But he made one miscalculation," Rosa said, her voice growing stronger as she processed the full implications of Harold's revelations. "He assumed we would remain isolated and helpless. He didn't expect us to find each other and create a family." Eleanor had reached the final pages of Harold's letter, and her expression shifted from anger to something approaching wonder. "There's more. Harold says that the original owner of this house, the one who supposedly left debts behind, never existed either. The house belongs to the territorial government, designated as public land grants for settlers who meet specific residency requirements." "What kind of requirements?" Catherine asked, her business instincts immediately alert to legal technicalities. "Continuous habitation for 1 year, improvement of the property, and contribution to the local community." Eleanor looked up from the letter with dawning realization. "Requirements that we've already met." "You mean," Beth said slowly, "that this house might actually belong to us, legally and legitimately?" "According to Harold's letter, if we can prove residency and improvement, we have a legitimate claim under the Homestead Act. Blackwood's entire scheme was based on preventing us from discovering our legal rights to the property. The implications were staggering. Not only had they survived Blackwood's attempts to destroy them, but they had unknowingly fulfilled the legal requirements to claim the home they'd fought so hard to defend. "There's one final revelation," Eleanor said, her voice now trembling with emotions too complex to name. "Harold says that Blackwood's original plan called for the evicted mail order, brides to be offered employment in his other enterprises, employment that would have amounted to forced prostitution as a way to work off their manufactured debts." The words hung in the air like poison smoke, making clear just how close they had all come to a fate worse than abandonment. Beth's sewing basket slipped from her numb fingers, and Rosa's grandmother's book fell closed with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent kitchen. "He would have destroyed us completely," Catherine said, her ledger forgotten as the full scope of their narrow escape became clear. "Body and soul." "But he didn't," Ezra said firmly, rising from his chair with the decisive movement of a man who had made a fundamental decision. He failed because he underestimated what people can accomplish when they refuse to be victims. Maggie picked up her medical bag, its familiar weight grounding her in the present moment. Harold's letter is evidence. Documentation of conspiracy and criminal intent that goes far beyond what we suspected. Evidence that needs to reach the territorial authorities, Eleanor added, carefully folding Harold's confession. This isn't just about our house anymore. It's about justice for everyone Blackwood has hurt. Rosa opened her grandmother's recipe book to a page near the back, where advice about dealing with enemies had been written in fading ink. Abuela wrote that sometimes the best revenge against those who try to destroy you is to build something beautiful where they expected to find only ruins. She looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their unlikely family, at Catherine's ledger documenting their victory over corruption, at Beth's sewing basket ready to create beauty from scraps, at Maggie's medical bag prepared to heal whatever wounds came next, at Eleanor's careful hands holding evidence of their vindication. I think, Rosa said softly, that's exactly what we've done. Outside, the town of Cedar Falls was waking up to a new day free from Blackwood's shadow. Inside the house on Elm Street, 6 people who had been strangers 8 months ago sat around a kitchen table and realized they had become something neither fraud nor force could destroy. A family built on choice rather than circumstance, held together by respect rather than obligation. Harold's letter had revealed the full scope of the conspiracy against them, but it had also revealed something else, the extraordinary power of ordinary people who refused to accept that they were powerless. So, Ezra said, looking around at their faces, what do we do now? Catherine reopened her ledger to a fresh page, ready to document whatever came next. Now we make sure this never happens to anyone else. Eleanor carefully tucked Harold's confession into her teaching materials, where it would be safe until they could present it to the proper authorities. Now we help other people understand their rights. Maggie closed her medical bag and stood with the purposeful movement of someone heading out to heal whatever needed healing. Now we take care of our community. Beth retrieved her fallen sewing basket and began organizing its contents with the methodical care of someone preparing to create something beautiful. Now we build something lasting. Rosa opened her grandmother's recipe book to a page about celebration feasts. Now we cook a meal worthy of this moment. And Ezra, looking around at the women who had taught him that home was something you built together rather than something you found alone, smiled for the first time since Sarah's death 21 years before. Now, he said, we live. Ezra's hunting rifle had been his father's before it was his, and his grandfather's before that. The Winchester had traveled from Pennsylvania to Colorado Territory in the wagon train that brought the McKinnon family west 30 years ago, and it had hung above the fireplace in his mountain cabin through 20 years of solitary exile. Now it rested across his knees as he sat on the front porch at dawn, watching the road that led to town, and wondering if he would need to use it before the sun set. Harold Pembroke's confession had reached the territorial authorities in Denver, but justice at the territorial level moved slowly, and Cornelius Blackwood's influence extended far beyond Cedar Falls. Word had come back through unofficial channels that powerful men were working to discredit Harold's testimony and secure Blackwood's release before a full investigation could be completed. You can't stay awake all night every night, Eleanor said, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee as the first light crept over the mountains. She'd been teaching early morning literacy classes to accommodate miners who worked late shifts, but Ezra suspected she'd risen early, specifically to check on his increasingly vigilant watch. Man doesn't need much sleep when he has something worth protecting, Ezra replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warmth of the cup was welcome in the mountain morning air, but not as welcome as Eleanor's presence beside him. Over the past weeks, as the implications of Harold's revelations had settled into their daily routines, something had shifted between them. The careful politeness that had marked their early interactions had given way to a deeper understanding, built on shared trials and mutual respect. Ezra found himself thinking about Eleanor's smile at unexpected moments, and he'd caught her watching him with an expression that suggested her thoughts might be traveling similar paths. "Catherine's been documenting everything," Eleanor said, settling into the chair beside his. "Every threat, every attempt at intimidation, every suspicious visitor. She says if Blackwood's people make a move against us, we'll have evidence of witness tampering and obstruction of justice." "Catherine's ledger won't stop bullets," Ezra said grimly, adjusting his grip on the rifle. "And desperate men do desperate things." From inside the house came the sounds of their unusual household beginning another day. Rosa was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast, her grandmother's recipes providing comfort and nourishment for whatever challenges might come. Maggie was packing her medical bag for her morning rounds, her healing skills now recognized throughout the county, despite the lingering scandal of her living arrangements. Beth was setting up her sewing station by the front window where the light was best, ready to transform fabric scraps into wedding dresses and hope. "They're not going to let us live in peace, are they?" Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Men like Blackwood don't accept defeat gracefully," Ezra confirmed. "They see it as a challenge to their authority, and they have too much at stake to just walk away." As if summoned by their conversation, dust appeared on the horizon, riders approaching at a pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. Ezra stood and called into the house. "Company coming. Everyone stay inside until we know what they want," but instead of Blackwood's hired guns. The approaching group proved to be Sheriff Morrison, accompanied by Judge Preston and two men Ezra didn't recognize, well-dressed Easterners whose expensive clothing and careful grooming marked them as government officials. "Mr. McKinnon," Judge Preston called as they dismounted. "These gentlemen are from the Territorial Attorney's Office in Denver. They'd like to speak with you and the ladies about Harold Pembroke's allegations." The taller of the two officials stepped forward, removing his hat with formal courtesy. "I'm Attorney General Mitchell, and this is Deputy Attorney Waters. We understand you've been threatened in connection with your testimony against Cornelius Blackwood." "Threatened is putting it mildly," Eleanor said, emerging from the house despite Ezra's warnings. "We've had armed men watching our property, mysterious accidents befalling our allies, and constant legal harassment designed to drive us from our home." Deputy Waters produced a notebook and began taking careful notes. "Can you provide specific documentation of these threats?" Catherine appeared with her ledger, its pages now filled with months of meticulous record-keeping. "Every incident, every visitor, every suspicious occurrence," she said, opening the book to reveal columns of detailed observations, all documented with dates, times, and witnesses where available. Attorney General Mitchell studied Catherine's careful documentation with obvious appreciation. "This level of detail is remarkable, Miss Williams. Have you considered a career in legal documentation?" "I've been more concerned with survival than career prospects," Catherine replied dryly, "though I've learned that paying attention to details can be the difference between justice and injustice." Rosa emerged from the kitchen with coffee for the officials, her hospitality extending even to government representatives who might determine their fate. Maggie and Beth flanked her, presenting a united front that spoke of months of shared adversity and mutual support. "We understand that Mr. Blackwood's schemes extended far beyond property fraud," Attorney General Mitchell said, accepting Rosa's coffee with grateful courtesy. "Harold Pembroke's confession suggests a conspiracy involving railroad officials and territorial government employees, a conspiracy that targeted vulnerable women specifically," Eleanor added, her teacher's instincts for organizing complex information serving her well in legal discussions. "We weren't random victims. We were chosen because our circumstances made us easy to exploit." Deputy Waters looked up from his note-taking. "That's a serious allegation. Do you have evidence supporting the claim of deliberate targeting?" Harold's letter provides specific details about how each of us was researched and manipulated, Maggie said, her medical training making her comfortable with providing precise testimony. The men who brought us west were either paid to abandon us or were fictional identities created specifically to strand us here. Attorney General Mitchell exchanged glances with his deputy, and Ezra could see the wheels of legal calculation turning behind their eyes. A conspiracy involving deliberate targeting of vulnerable women would play well with territorial voters increasingly concerned about women's rights and frontier justice. The problem we face, Attorney General Mitchell said carefully, is that powerful interests are working to discredit Mr. Pembroke's testimony. There are rumors that he was coerced into making false accusations, that his confession was fabricated by disgruntled tenants seeking to avoid legitimate debts. Harold left town voluntarily, Eleanor pointed out. His letter arrived days after Blackwood's arrest, with no possibility of coercion from us. Nevertheless, without Mr. Pembroke's direct testimony, much of our case relies on circumstantial evidence and victim statements, Deputy Waters explained. Strong evidence, but potentially vulnerable to challenge by skilled defense attorneys. Ezra understood the subtext immediately. You're saying Blackwood might walk free, despite everything we've uncovered. I'm saying that justice often depends on more than just being right, Attorney General Mitchell replied. It depends on being able to prove you're right, in ways that can't be dismissed or discredited. The officials departed an hour later, promising to do everything possible within the constraints of territorial law, but leaving behind the clear impression that Blackwood's wealth and connections might prove stronger than evidence and testimony. As their dust settled on the road back to town, the 6 residents of the house on Elm Street gathered on the front porch to discuss what they'd learned. They're preparing us for disappointment, Catherine said, closing her ledger with obvious frustration. All our documentation, all our evidence, and it might not be enough. It will be enough, Rosa said firmly, her grandmother's recipe book tucked under her arm like a shield against despair. Abuela always said that truth has a way of finding the light, no matter how deep people try to bury it. Truth needs help sometimes, Maggie observed, checking the contents of her medical bag with the automatic precision of someone always ready for emergencies. And we might need to be the ones providing that help. Beth looked up from the dress she was hemming. Another wedding commission that spoke of their growing acceptance in the community despite continuing controversies. What kind of help? The kind that makes it impossible for powerful men to ignore what's right, Eleanor said, her teacher's instincts recognizing a moment when abstract principles needed to be translated into concrete action. As the day progressed, their conversation was interrupted by a series of visitors that gradually revealed the scope of community support they'd built. Without fully realizing it, Mrs. Henderson, from the general store, brought news that 17 families had signed a petition, supporting their right to remain in their home. Dr. Morrison stopped by to inform Maggie that the Territorial Medical Board had officially recognized her healing skills, making any attempt to discredit her testimony professionally risky. Most significantly, a delegation of Chinese families, led by Mrs. Chen, arrived with a carefully written statement in both English and Chinese, detailing Blackwood's systematic exploitation of immigrant communities and documenting patterns of discrimination that supported the broader conspiracy charges. You see, Rosa said, as the Chen delegation departed after sharing tea and solidarity. Truth finding the light. But even as community support grew, so did signs of mounting pressure from Blackwood's allies. Deputy Waters returned that evening with word that the Territorial Attorney's Office was being pressured to drop the investigation in favor of local resolution. Sheriff Morrison reported mysterious visitors asking questions about the household's moral character and suggesting that the women's testimony might be unreliable due to their unconventional lifestyle. They're going to try to destroy us socially if they can't defeat us legally, Eleanor observed, her experience with small-town politics making her sensitive to the subtle weapons of reputation and respectability. Ezra lifted his rifle from where it rested against the porch railing. checking its action with the careful attention of a man who understood that words and documents might not be sufficient protection for the people he'd come to love. Then we'd better be ready for whatever they try, he said, as night fell over Cedar Falls. The house on Elm Street settled into watchful quiet. Catherine updated her ledger with the day's developments. Rosa consulted her grandmother's book for recipes that would provide strength and comfort in the trials ahead. Maggie organized her medical supplies for whatever healing might be needed. Beth worked by lamplight on a wedding dress for a bride who represented hope in uncertain times. Eleanor sat beside Ezra on the front porch, both of them aware that the careful dance of attraction between them was approaching a moment when safety might require declarations that couldn't be taken back. "Whatever happens," Eleanor said softly, "I want you to know that these months with all of you have been the happiest of my life. Even with the threats and the legal troubles and the uncertainty, especially with those things," Eleanor replied, "because they've shown me what we're capable of when we stand together." Ezra's hand found hers in the darkness between their chairs, and for a moment the weight of his father's rifle seemed less important than the warmth of connection that had driven him down from the mountains and into this complicated, dangerous, wonderful life. "Tomorrow we find out if justice means anything in this territory," he said. "Tomorrow," Eleanor agreed, "we find out what we're really made of." The town charter of Cedar Falls was a document most residents had never seen, filed away in the courthouse basement among other founding papers that gathered dust and were forgotten by everyone except the occasional historian or lawyer seeking obscure legal precedents. But Catherine's methodical research had uncovered it 3 days earlier, and its contents had the potential to change everything. Article 7, Section 3, Catherine read aloud from the carefully transcribed text. Her ledger opened beside the original charter document that Judge Preston had allowed them to examine. "Any resident who contributes materially to the health, education, or economic welfare of the community for a period of 6 months or more shall be considered a founding citizen, with full rights of property ownership and civic participation, regardless of previous legal status." The courthouse was packed beyond capacity for what everyone understood would be the final hearing in the case of Blackwood versus the residents of 47 Elm Street. Word had spread throughout the territory that this small frontier town was witnessing a legal battle that could set precedents for property rights, women's legal standing, and the limits of corporate power in territorial development. Attorney General Mitchell sat at the prosecution table with Deputy Waters, their case files thick with evidence, but their expressions cautious. Across from them, Blackwood's legal team occupied nearly half the available space, 5 lawyers from Denver and San Francisco whose expensive suits and confident bearing testified to the resources arrayed against the women's claims. Eleanor sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Rosa and Maggie, with Beth and Ezra completing their group. Each of them carried the artifact that had come to symbolize their contribution to their unusual family. Eleanor clutched a slate with lesson plans for her literacy students. Rosa held her grandmother's recipe book. Maggie kept her medical bag at her feet. Beth's sewing kit rested in her lap, and Ezra's hand never strayed far from the walking stick that had replaced his rifle in the courtroom setting. "Your Honor," began Marcus Thornfield, Blackwood's lead attorney, "my client has been the victim of an elaborate fraud perpetrated by desperate women willing to make any accusation to avoid paying legitimate debts. The so-called evidence presented by the prosecution relies entirely on the uncorroborated testimony of Harold Pembroke, a man who fled the jurisdiction rather than face questioning about his own criminal activities." Judge Preston's expression remained carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the political calculations behind his eyes. The territorial government was under pressure from railroad interests and Eastern investors who viewed the case as a test of whether Colorado territory would protect business interests or surrender to populist sentiment. "The defense will prove," Thornfield continued, "that these women violated multiple territorial laws by cohabiting with an unmarried man. by operating unlicensed businesses and by conspiring to defraud legitimate creditors. Mr. Blackwood's only crime was extending excessive charity to women who repaid his kindness with false accusations and manufactured evidence. Attorney General Mitchell rose for his opening statement, and Eleanor felt her heart racing as she realized that everything they'd built together might depend on the next few minutes. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Cornelius Blackwood orchestrated a conspiracy involving dozens of territorial officials, railroad executives and false business agents to systematically defraud property owners throughout this county. The women he targeted were chosen specifically because their vulnerable legal status made them easy victims for a scheme that violated both territorial and federal law. Furthermore, Mitchell continued, we will demonstrate that far from being the criminals Mr. Thornfield describes, these women have become exemplary citizens who have contributed more to the welfare of Cedar Falls in 8 months than some families accomplish in decades. The first witness called was Dr. Morrison, whose testimony about Maggie's medical contributions was interrupted by objections from Blackwood's legal team about unlicensed practice of medicine. But when Judge Preston asked for specific examples of harm caused by Maggie's treatments, Thornfield could only cite regulatory violations rather than actual medical malpractice. Dr. Morrison, Attorney General Mitchell asked, in your professional opinion, have Miss O'Brien's medical interventions been beneficial to the community? Absolutely. She saved at least 3 lives that I know of, and her knowledge of herbal remedies has provided relief for conditions I couldn't treat effectively with conventional medicine. Mrs. Henderson testified about Eleanor's literacy program, noting that adult reading classes had reduced accidents at the mine because workers could now read safety warnings and equipment instructions. Before Miss Hartwell's classes, Mrs. Henderson explained, we lost 2 miners every year to preventable accidents. Since she started teaching, we've had 0 fatalities related to inability to read safety protocols. The testimony about Rosa's contributions was more complex, involving translations that had prevented legal misunderstandings and herbal treatments that had complemented conventional medical care. Several Spanish-speaking families testified that Rosa had helped them understand contracts and legal documents that might otherwise have resulted in exploitation, similar to Blackwood's schemes. Beth's impact was measured in wedding dresses and hope young women throughout the county who had been able to afford beautiful gowns because of her skilled and affordable work. But more than that, her quiet presence had provided comfort to families dealing with loss and transition, a contribution that was difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. These women, Attorney General Mitchell argued as he concluded the morning's testimony, have done exactly what our territorial laws encourage. They've built community, provided essential services, and contributed to the common welfare. The town charter recognizes such contributions as the foundation of citizenship, but Thornfield's cross-examination was brutal and methodical, focusing on technical violations of licensing laws, questions about moral character, and suggestions that the women's testimony was coordinated and unreliable. Miss Hartwell, Thornfield said during his questioning of Eleanor, isn't it true that you've been living in an unmarried state with Mr. McKinnon for 8 months, in direct violation of territorial statutes regarding cohabitation? We maintain separate bedrooms and appropriate boundaries, Eleanor replied steadily. Our living arrangement is one of necessity and mutual support, not impropriety. But you cannot deny that your household violates conventional moral standards. I can deny that morality is determined by convention rather than by how we treat one another, Eleanor said, her teacher's authority making her voice carry clearly through the courtroom. We have harmed no one and helped many. If that violates your moral standards, perhaps your standards need examination rather than our behavior. The courtroom stirred at her bold response, and Eleanor could see approval in many faces among the packed gallery. But she could also see disapproval from others, and she understood that Judge Preston was feeling pressure from multiple directions. During the lunch recess, the six of them gathered in a small room behind the courthouse where Catherine spread out her ledger and they reviewed their situation with the methodical precision that had gotten them this far. "Thornfield's strategy is working," Catherine observed. "He's making us the criminals instead of Blackwood, and some of the jury members are responding to that approach." "What about the town charter?" Rosa asked, her grandmother's recipe book open to a page about persistence in the face of obstacles. "Does that change anything?" "Only if Judge Preston is willing to apply it," Eleanor replied, "and only if we can prove we meet the residency and contribution requirements." 6 months, Maggie said, consulting her medical bag as if it were a calendar. "We've been here 8 months as of last week, contributing to health, education, and economic welfare," Beth added quietly. "I think we've done that." Ezra, who had been silent through most of their legal strategizing, finally spoke up. "The question isn't whether we've met the requirements. The question is whether they'll let us win even if we have." Through the courthouse window, they could see Blackwood's legal team, conferring with well-dressed men who had arrived from Denver that morning. Territorial officials and railroad representatives whose presence suggested that the stakes had risen beyond their small property dispute. "They're scared," Catherine said, her business instincts reading the subtle signs of pressure and desperation in their opponent's behavior. "Men like that don't send 5 lawyers and 3 political representatives unless they're afraid of losing something important, or unless they're determined to make an example of us," Eleanor replied grimly. As they prepared to return for the afternoon session, Rosa opened her grandmother's book to a page near the end, where advice about facing final battles had been written in careful Spanish script. Abuela wrote that sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything to find out what you really have, Rosa translated. She said the moment when you stop being afraid of losing is the moment when you become capable of winning. Eleanor looked around at their faces, determined, frightened but not defeated, and felt the same fierce protectiveness she'd seen in Ezra when he'd decided to fight for their right to remain together. "Then let's go find out what we really have," she said. The marriage certificate was blank when Eleanor pulled it from her teaching materials, but the symbolism of her action sent a ripple of shock through the packed courtroom. She had stood up in the middle of Marcus Thornfield's closing argument, interrupting his systematic destruction of their characters with a gesture that transformed the entire nature of the proceedings. "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had taught unruly children to pay attention, "I request permission to address a factual error in Mr. Thornfield's argument." "Miss Hartwell," Judge Preston said carefully, "this is highly irregular. You're not an attorney. And this is the defense's closing statement. With respect, Your Honor, Mr. Thornfield has based his entire argument on the assumption that our household violates territorial laws regarding cohabitation. I would like to correct that misunderstanding." Thornfield's confident expression shifted to confusion as Eleanor held up the marriage certificate for the court to see. "Your Honor, this is inappropriate grandstanding, Mr. McKinnon," Eleanor said, turning to face Ezra with a smile that was part love and part challenge. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my husband?" The courthouse erupted in surprise, confusion, and not a little delight. Rosa clasped her hands together in joy, while Maggie began laughing with the kind of relief that came from seeing a brilliant solution to an impossible problem. Beth smiled through tears, and Catherine actually applauded before catching herself and returning to professional composure. Ezra stood slowly, his weathered face transformed by a smile that erased 20 years of grief and isolation. "Eleanor Hartwell," he said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I would be honored to marry you if you'll have a broken-down mountain man who's still learning how to live among civilized people." "I'll take my chances," Eleanor replied. Extending her hand to him, Judge Preston looked around his courtroom, which had become something between a legal proceeding and a community celebration. "Miss Hartwell, while I appreciate the romantic gesture, Marriage requires proper legal procedures. Actually, Your Honor, interrupted a new voice from the back of the courtroom, territorial law provides for emergency marriage ceremonies in cases where legal necessity requires immediate resolution. Everyone turned to see a woman in traveling clothes making her way through the crowd, someone Eleanor didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested official authority. I'm Territory Clerk Sarah Mitchell, the newcomer announced. Attorney General Mitchell is my husband, and I've been following this case with considerable interest. I'm authorized to perform emergency marriages when legal circumstances require immediate resolution, and it appears that the question of cohabitation is central to this proceeding. This is preposterous, Thornfield protested. You can't just marry people in the middle of a trial to retroactively legitimize illegal behavior. Actually, Territory Clerk Mitchell replied calmly, I can marry people anywhere legal necessity requires it, and territorial law specifically recognizes such marriages as legitimate from the date of cohabitation, if the parties can demonstrate continuous intent to formalize their relationship. Catherine stood up, her ledger in hand. Your Honor, my records show 8 months of shared household responsibilities, joint financial decisions, and mutual support that would constitute evidence of marital intent under territorial common law precedents. Furthermore, Eleanor added, her teacher's instincts for dramatic timing serving her well, our marriage would make this proceeding largely irrelevant to the central question of property ownership. As my husband, Mr. McKinnon's claim to the property would extend to me regardless of my previous legal status, and our household would be legitimized under any interpretation of territorial law. Judge Preston was beginning to look like a man who had wandered into someone else's complicated family drama. Miss Hartwell, or Mrs. McKinnon as you apparently intend to become, this is still highly irregular. With respect. Your Honor, Ezra said, stepping forward to take Eleanor's hand. Nothing about this case has been regular from the beginning. We've been fighting for the right to build a family and a home, despite people who wanted to destroy both. If Eleanor's willing to marry me, I can't think of a better place to do it than in a courtroom full of our neighbors and friends. Territory. Clerk Mitchell opened her official case and produced the materials needed for an emergency marriage ceremony. If both parties are willing and of legal age, I can perform the ceremony immediately. Do you, Ezra McKinnon, take Eleanor Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, Ezra said without hesitation. Do you, Eleanor Hartwell, take Ezra McKinnon to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying absolute conviction. By the authority vested in me by the Territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. The courthouse exploded in cheers and applause that took several minutes for Judge Preston to quiet. When order was finally restored, the entire legal dynamic had shifted in ways that Thornfield was still trying to process. Your Honor, Attorney General Mitchell said, rising with obvious satisfaction, in light of this development, I move to dismiss all charges related to improper cohabitation. Mr. and Mrs. McKinnon are now legally married. Their household is legitimized under territorial law, and the defense's moral objections are rendered moot. Furthermore, he continued, the marriage certificate provides clear documentation of Mr. McKinnon's intent to establish permanent residency in Cedar Falls, which supports the prosecution's argument under the town charter regarding founding citizenship rights. Thornfield stood up, his confident demeanor finally beginning to crack. Your Honor, this theatrical display doesn't address the fundamental questions of debt and property ownership. Actually, it does, Catherine interrupted, opening her ledger to a page she'd been saving for this moment. Your Honor, my research into territorial marriage law reveals that marriage creates joint ownership of all property acquired during cohabitation, regardless of whose name appears on original documents. Since Mr. McKinnon's purchase of the house occurred during their period of cohabitation with clear marital intent, Mrs. McKinnon now has equal legal claim to the property. Moreover, she continued, as a married couple, They qualify for enhanced homestead protections under federal law that supersede any territorial debt collection procedures Mr. Blackwood might attempt to invoke. Judge Preston rubbed his temples, clearly overwhelmed by the legal complexities that had emerged from what should have been a simple property dispute. Mr. Thornfield, how does your client wish to respond to these developments? Thornfield conferred quickly with his legal team and the railroad representatives who had been observing from the gallery. The whispered conversation grew increasingly heated as the implications of the marriage became clear. Your Honor, Thornfield said finally, my client maintains that the debts in question predate any marriage and remain valid regardless of the defendant's current legal status. Then let's resolve the debt question once and for all, Eleanor said, her teacher's instincts recognizing a moment when decisive action was needed. Rosa, would you please translate this for everyone? Rosa stood up, her grandmother's recipe book in her hands, and began speaking in rapid Spanish to the Chinese families in the gallery. Mrs. Chen responded, also in Spanish, which Rosa translated for the court. Mrs. Chen says that Mr. Blackwood's rental agreements were never signed because he refused to provide them in any language the tenants could read. She says they paid money for shelter, but they never agreed to the interest rates and penalty terms he's now claiming. Your Honor, Attorney General Mitchell said, seizing the opening, if the alleged debts were based on agreements that the tenants couldn't understand due to language barriers, those agreements are void under territorial consumer protection statutes. Furthermore, Catherine added, consulting her ledger, my documentation shows that the payments these families made to Mr. Blackwood were sufficient to cover reasonable rent for the accommodations provided. The additional charges he's claiming are based on terms that were never properly disclosed or agreed upon. The legal foundation of Blackwood's case was crumbling, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. The railroad representatives in the gallery began making urgent notes, clearly understanding that their carefully planned property acquisition was falling apart. Your Honor, Thornfield said desperately, regardless of these technical objections, my client has legitimate business interests in this property that predate any of these arrangements. What legitimate business interests? Eleanor asked, her teacher's voice cutting through legal obfuscation with the clarity of someone used to demanding straight answers from evasive students. The business of defrauding property owners. The business of conspiring with railroad officials to manipulate territorial development. The business of targeting vulnerable women for systematic exploitation. Your Honor, Attorney General Mitchell said, standing with the bearing of a man presenting his final argument, the evidence is clear. Cornelius Blackwood orchestrated a criminal conspiracy involving multiple territorial officials, railroad executives, and fraudulent business agents. He systematically targeted vulnerable women, destroyed their lives deliberately, and used their desperation to facilitate a land grab scheme that violated both territorial and federal law. The defendants have not only proven their innocence of any wrongdoing, but they have demonstrated exactly the kind of community contribution and civic virtue that our territorial laws are designed to protect and encourage. They have built a home, created a family, and strengthened their community in ways that honor the best traditions of frontier settlement. Judge Preston looked around his courtroom, at the married couple standing hand in hand, at the Chinese families who had found their voice through Rosa's translations, at the packed gallery of neighbors who had come to support their unusual household. In the matter of property ownership, Judge Preston announced, I find that Mr. and Mrs. McKinnon have established legitimate claim to 47 Elm Street under both territorial homestead laws and the founding citizenship provisions of the Cedar Falls Town Charter. In the matter of alleged debts, I find that the contracts in question are void due to language barriers and failure to provide proper disclosure of terms and conditions. In the matter of the criminal conspiracy charges against Cornelius Blackwood, I'm referring all evidence to the Territorial Attorney General for federal prosecution. The courthouse erupted in celebration that Judge Preston made no attempt to quiet. Eleanor found herself swept into Ezra's arms, spinning around in a dance of joy and relief that 8 months of struggle had finally ended in vindication. Rosa opened her grandmother's recipe book to a page about celebration feasts, already planning how to feed the crowd that would undoubtedly gather at their house that evening. Maggie hugged her medical bag like a dance partner, laughing with the kind of joy that came from winning against impossible odds. Beth clutched her sewing kit and smiled through happy tears, understanding that she would now have time to create all the beautiful things she had been dreaming of. Catherine closed her ledger with satisfaction, its pages having served their purpose in ways she had never imagined when she first began keeping careful records. The notebook that had started as a simple household account had become the weapon that defeated corruption and the foundation for a new kind of justice. As the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor looked around the courthouse that had nearly been the scene of their defeat and realized it had instead become the place where their family had been legally recognized and their home legally secured. "Well, Mrs. McKinnon," Ezra said, his arm around his new wife's waist, "what do we do now?" Eleanor smiled, her hand resting on the marriage certificate that had changed everything. "Now we go home and live happily ever after." The new house deed bore all 6 names in careful script, documenting their transformation from strangers to family in the eyes of the law. 6 months after the courtroom wedding that had become Cedar Falls legend, the document represented more than property ownership. It was recognition that home could be built by choice rather than circumstance, by commitment rather than blood relation. Eleanor McKinnon stood in the kitchen of 47 Elm Street, morning light streaming through windows that Ezra had repaired and Rosa had adorned with herbs that grew in neat boxes on the sills. The house bore little resemblance to the broken-down structure they'd inhabited 9 months earlier. Fresh paint-covered walls that had been patched and straightened. New floorboards replaced rotted sections, and the roof no longer leaked during spring rains. But the greatest transformation was in the feeling of the place. What had once been shelter had become home in all the ways that mattered. "The Henderson girl looks beautiful," Beth observed from her station by the front window, where she was putting finishing touches on another wedding dress. Her sewing kit lay open beside her, its contents now supplemented by tools and materials that reflected her growing reputation as the finest seamstress in the county. Simple lines but elegant, just what she wanted. She wanted to look like a lady, Rosa said from the stove, where she was preparing the celebration feast that would follow the afternoon ceremony. Her grandmother's recipe book lay open to a page about food that brought joy, its margins filled with notes about local ingredients and adaptations that made ancient recipes work in their new mountain home. She said if Beth Patterson could make a wedding dress fit for a queen on a seamstress's budget, she wanted to be Beth's customer forever. Catherine looked up from her ledger, which had evolved from household accounts to business records for the various enterprises their unusual family now supported. Eleanor's literacy school had grown to include students from 3 counties. Maggie's medical practice was officially recognized and regularly consulted by Dr. Morrison on difficult cases. Rosa's herbal knowledge had made her indispensable to families dealing with everything from infant colic to arthritis. Beth's sewing brought brides from as far away as Denver. Catherine's business consulting had helped a dozen families avoid the kind of exploitation Blackwood had specialized in. "Speaking of customers," Catherine said, making a note in her carefully maintained columns, "Mrs. Rodriguez wants to discuss expanding her family's trading business. She needs help understanding the territorial licensing requirements for importing goods from Mexico. Can we handle the translation work and the legal consulting?" Eleanor asked, reviewing lesson plans for the adult literacy class she would teach that evening after the wedding celebration. "Between Rosa's language skills and my business knowledge, yes. And the fee will be enough to finish the repairs on the back porch." Eleanor smiled at the casual way Catherine discussed their interwoven financial future. The ledger that had once tracked their desperate scramble for survival now documented a thriving constellation of small businesses that supported each other and strengthened their community. They had become exactly what the territorial laws encouraged: productive citizens who contributed to the common welfare while building something sustainable for themselves. Ezra entered through the back door, his arms full of wood for the cooking fires that would be needed for the evening's celebration. The mountain man, who had come to town 9 months ago with nothing but $1 and desperate loneliness, bore little resemblance to the confident, engaged husband and community member he had become. Regular meals and steady companionship had filled out his frame and eased the lines of isolation around his eyes. More importantly, the fear that had driven him to 20 years of solitude had been replaced by the quiet confidence that came from having people to protect and purposes larger than mere survival. "Looks like our county's planning to attend the Henderson wedding," he reported, stacking wood beside the stove with the careful precision of someone who understood that small tasks done well contributed to larger successes. "Mrs. Henderson says it's because people want to see another Beth Patterson creation. But I think they're really coming to see how a proper wedding should be done, meaning not in a courtroom during a legal proceeding," Eleanor asked with the kind of gentle teasing that had become natural between them. "Meaning with proper planning and community support," Ezra replied, kissing his wife's cheek as he passed her on the way to wash up. "Though I have to admit, a courthouse wedding has given other couples some interesting ideas about making their ceremonies memorable." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the front window, where Sheriff Morrison was dismounting with the careful movements of a man carrying important news. Behind him rode Attorney General Mitchell, whose presence suggested developments in the ongoing federal investigation of Blackwood's conspiracy. "Ladies, Mr. McKinnon," Sheriff Morrison said as Eleanor opened the door. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important. Just normal Saturday morning preparations for a wedding celebration," Eleanor replied. "Please come in. Rosa's got coffee ready, and there's always room at our table." Attorney General Mitchell accepted the offered coffee with the gratitude of a man who had been riding hard from Denver. "I wanted to deliver the news in person," he said without preamble. "Cornelius Blackwood has been convicted on 17 federal counts of conspiracy, fraud, and violation of territorial development statutes. He's been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, and all property acquired through fraudulent means is being returned to its rightful owners." The kitchen fell silent as the implications settled. 9 months of fear and uncertainty had finally ended, with justice that reached beyond their individual case to protect dozens of other families. "What about his associates?" Catherine asked, her business instincts focused on ensuring the conspiracy had been completely dismantled. 5 territorial officials have been removed from office and are facing their own federal charges. The railroad executives involved have been sanctioned by their companies and barred from further territorial development projects. Harold Pembroke has been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, but he's been permanently banned from operating any kind of land or property business. "So it's really over," Maggie said, her medical bag sitting forgotten beside her chair as she processed the news. "It's over," Sheriff Morrison confirmed, "and I've been authorized to inform you that the territorial government is implementing new protections for vulnerable populations, specifically including mail-order brides and immigrant families, based on evidence and recommendations that emerged from your case." Eleanor felt tears she hadn't expected gathering in her eyes. Their struggle had not only secured their own home and family, but had created protections for others who might face similar exploitation. "There's one more thing," Attorney General Mitchell said, producing an official-looking document from his case. "The territorial legislature has voted to commend your household for exemplary citizenship and community service. You're being recognized as model territorial residents whose contributions represent the best of frontier settlement values." Rosa opened her grandmother's recipe book to a page about celebration and Thanksgiving. already adjusting her plans for the evening's feast to accommodate the magnitude of what they were celebrating. "This calls for something special," she announced. "A meal worthy of complete victory." "Not just victory," Beth corrected softly, her sewing kit open beside her as she worked on the final details of the Henderson wedding dress. "Family, home, the things we built while we were fighting for the right to keep them." After the officials left, the 6 residents of 47 Elm Street gathered around their kitchen table, the same table where they had planned desperate strategies and pooled meager resources, where Catherine's ledger had documented their slow progress from survival to success, where Rosa's recipes had fed both body and hope through the darkest months of uncertainty. "So what do we do now?" Eleanor asked, echoing Ezra's question from the courthouse 6 months earlier. "Now we live," Ezra replied, reaching for his wife's hand. "We help our neighbors, we build our businesses, we take care of each other. Now we make sure no one else goes through what we went through," Catherine added, closing her ledger with satisfaction. "We use what we've learned to help other people understand their rights and protect themselves from exploitation. Now we cook feasts and sew wedding dresses and teach children to read and heal the sick." Rosa said her grandmother's book opened to recipes for abundance rather than survival. "Now we remember," Maggie added. "The family isn't always about blood relation. Sometimes it's about people who choose to stand together when standing alone isn't enough." "Now we trust," Beth said quietly, "that good things can happen when people refuse to give up on each other." Eleanor looked around the table at the faces of people who had become more than housemates, more than allies in a legal battle, more than friends. They had become the family she'd never expected to find, in a home that had been bought for $1 and defended with everything they had. Outside, the town of Cedar Falls was preparing for another celebration, the Henderson wedding that would bring the community together in joy rather than legal conflict. Inside the house on Elm Street, 6 people who had learned that home was something you built together, rather than something you found alone, were preparing to welcome their neighbors and friends to a feast that would celebrate not just victory, but the deeper truth that had sustained them through months of struggle. Sometimes the best things in life couldn't be bought at any price. Sometimes they could only be created by people willing to risk everything for the chance to build something beautiful together. The deed to the house bore 6 names, but the home it represented had been built by something more valuable than legal documents or property law. It had been built by the kind of love that chose commitment over convenience, community over isolation, hope over fear. As Eleanor opened her recipe book, for she had begun keeping one of her own, filled with Rosa's teachings and her own discoveries, she smiled at the thought that 9 months ago she had been a failed mail-order bride with nothing but educational credentials and broken dreams. Now she was Mrs. Ezra McKinnon, co-owner of a home that had become the heart of an extended community, partner in a family business that supported dozens of other families, and proof that sometimes the most unlikely people could build the most extraordinary things when they decided to trust each other with their futures. The dollar that had bought their house had been the best investment any of them had ever made, not because of what it had purchased, but because of what it had made possible. It had bought them time and space to discover that they belonged together, that their individual skills could create something greater than the sum of their parts, and that home was indeed something you built one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of faith at a time. As the afternoon sun filled their kitchen with golden light, Eleanor McKinnon opened her book to a recipe for celebration cake and began planning another feast for the family she had chosen and who had chosen her in return.